Okay, so I'm going to turn the audio on the stream simply for the sake of having a recorded version online, but we don't, for the sake of not having to deal with that delay, I'm going to actually interface with you through Google Meet. Okay, just because I can respond faster to any questions here. Okay, so we need to talk about signal strength. We need to talk about connections, about how you're plugging stuff in and what you're doing and what you're dealing with here. So there's three different levels of um, uh, signal strength. There's mic/instrument level, line level, and if you're writing notes, leave a little bit of space because there's more than one type of line level. And then there's speaker level. Okay? These are three different levels of signal, and we're talking about levels in terms of how much electricity is going through the cable. Okay. Microphone and instrument level is self-explanatory. It's the amount of signal strength that comes off of a microphone or a guitar or a keyboard. And speaker level is pretty self-explanatory. It's the amount of signal that's going through a speaker cable. Now, of these three, speaker cable is the only one that could hurt you. The only one that you really have to be careful with, right? If you're talking about powered speakers in a home stereo, not so much. If you're talking about a 10,000 watt power amp at a arena concert, yes, that can knock you off on your ass and send you to the hospital. So you want to pay attention to what you're working with there. We're not going to deal with that anytime soon. So, but just know that that's the dangerous stuff is all in the speaker line. But speaker signal level only exists between a power amplifier and a speaker. So that's the only place you're going to find it. So we can just put that off the table. I'm not even going to mention that, but maybe once or twice, maybe ever again. Mic and instrument level is also very weak and not going to feel. You could put a microphone cable on your tongue and you're not going to feel a thing, right? There's nothing there to feel. Yeah. So if we think back through the routing discussion, the video, the microphone preamplifier's job is to get your mic or instrument level up to line level. So most of the discussion we're going to have is going to be about line level because line level is what most audio gear wants to deal with. It's just the general level of voltage that audio gear operates on happily. So inside of the interface we have there, and in the little mixers we have there, that's all line level. The cables coming from the interface going to the Genelex, line level. The cables going from the little submixer of the keyboards, oops, there aren't cables yet, but there will be. Sorry, I just realized I didn't get up there to fix that yet. Those are line level, etc., etc. So once the sound is in a console, it's line level. Now, unfortunately, there are two types of line level. There's consumer line level, and there's professional line level. And you need to know that they are marked in two ways. Consumer line level is -10. Professional line level is +4. Why neither of those are at 0 is a long story that is boring and not important. But just remember that professional is +4 and consumer is -10. On mixing equipment, on audio gear, sometimes you'll see an output or an input that just says -10 or +4 next to the connection. That means it's either a professional or a consumer level system.
Is that relative to anything at all? Like, is that like 10 dB or something like that? Like dBFS or something?
It's dB. It's relative in terms of dB, but again, why it's -10 and +4 instead of 0 is just, it's a long story that's boring and not important. The thing that you do need to know is that there's a 14 decibel difference between the two. Right? That's the only part that's really crucial. So this comes into play in a number of ways. So if you have let's say, and this is where it mostly comes into play. Let's say I have my mixing console out and I am I have my mixing console out, and I am running sound for a band. And one of the guitar player and the guitar player's wife, this has actually happened to me recently. The guitar player's wife came up and said, "I brought my portable recorder. Can I plug in and get the mix off of the board?" Sure, absolutely. Except your portable recorder is a cheap portable recorder, and it has consumer level line in. It's got a -10 line in. What that means for me is that if I send her an output from my professional gear that spits out +4 line level, my meters will say that my level is fine, but I will distort the crap out of her consumer recorder because it will be 14 decibels louder than the consumer recorder expects to get. So for me, I will take that output and I will turn it down 14 dB. I literally go to the master output for that output and I just turn it down to -14 and I make up the difference. And it looks like I'm giving her a weak signal, but her recorder is totally happy. It's getting a strong signal and it's totally happy. So you just have to pay attention to that mismatch. The other potential thing that happens a lot is somebody gives me a phone or a laptop or a DVD, well, not so much anymore, but a Blu-ray player or something like that, consumer devices, and I plug it into my mixer. The only downside there is that it comes in really quiet, right? Because it's quieter than it expects to be. So I just have to boost my gain 14 dB to get it to be the same output as a professional CD player or DVD player would have been. So just be aware that there's a discrepancy between there. It's really not a big issue if you're going from consumer to professional because you just turn up the input, but you really have to pay attention when you're going from professional to consumer if you're going to blow it out. Okay? So those are your different signal strengths. Now let's talk about different types of cable. If you're looking at the stream, you'll see the mess that I just put on the console here. Yeah, somebody didn't wrap this very well. I'm going to fix that. Okay, so when we talk about types of cables, now this is a different discussion. This is not, I'm going to clean this up. This is a different discussion. This is not, consumer or professional level. It doesn't really take special cables. Cable doesn't care what you put through it. So this is a separate kind of discussion. So we're going to talk about the type of connectors you have. Now, you're going to find out very quickly that the type of connector only defines how you plug it in. It does not define what's going through it necessarily. So anyway, just leave room in your notes. Don't pack everything close together. You're probably going to come back and put all sorts of little extra things in there. So the most obvious one, the one that you probably see all the time, is this guy, right? Your good old XLR. Okay? And there's 3 pins to an XLR connector. Now an XLR connector is what we call, it's probably the most common type of cable, and it's what we call a balanced cable. And I just realized if I don't plug my laptop in, I'm going to have a problem. Give me a second. Okay, so you have a kind of cable. You have balanced and unbalanced cables. So an unbalanced cable has 2 wires in it. And an unbalanced cable is like a guitar cable. That's probably the most common example of an unbalanced cable. Where's power? Oh, thanks. So an unbalanced cable is really only good for about 25 feet, and then it starts to get interference. Okay? So guitar cables are unbalanced. Anybody that has a 50-foot guitar cable is nuts because you're just going to be picking up all sorts of radio stations and things. It's going to be really bad. So you can only go about 25 feet or so. And the way that an unbalanced cable works is you have what's called the ground, which is if you open up the cable, it's just bare wire, and then you have a wire that's kind of got some plastic around it, and that is the hot wire. So you have ground and then you have hot, so or the positive or whatever you want to call it. The best way I can explain how a cable works is that, you know the diagram that I've been drawing over and over again, where I draw a line and then you draw the waveform on top of it, right? And you remember how I took that drawing and I assigned mathematical values? Like I have the center line and then I drew the wave, and I could be one unit above and 1 unit below because I can measure that based on where the center line is. Does that make sense? So think about that concept. From an electrical standpoint, the ground is the straight line, and the signal cable is the wave. From an electrical standpoint, the reason that your equipment works is because the only reason that the wave makes any sense is because it is measured in relation to the constant ground. Does that make sense? So in that drawing that I keep making, that line is the ground, it's the reference, and then the changing signal, which is your audio, is in relation to that, and that's how Audio Gear reads your audio. That's a massive simplification of how it works, but that's basically the general gist of it. So, great, this works just fine for about 25 feet. Guitars, keyboards, all that kind of stuff works fine. Yahoo. The problem is that we a lot of times have to go farther than 25 feet, obviously. So, and the problem is that after about 25 feet, that line of wire starts to act like an antenna, because it is an antenna. It's physically an antenna. So what happens when we have to go further than that? So everybody's been in Cowan, right? Probably, or at least you've seen a picture of Cowan. I normally can say everybody's been in Cowan, but this year that's not necessarily true. So if you've been in Cowan, there's a mixing position at the back of the hall, but then there's a bunch of mic connections on stage. There's actually 12 mic connections under the front of the stage. There's 8 mic connections on either side, left and right of the stage. There's another 4 back in the scene shop. There's 8 downstairs in the green room. They're all over the building, actually. When they wired that, they put cables all over the building. Those cables go from the mixing board in the back down into the basements. They go all the way to the fronts, and then they come back up to the floor, go through some more cabling, go through some more conduit, some more tubes, and then they go into a box, and then they become connections, at which point you connect another 25 to 50 feet of mic cable to put the microphone where it is you want on stage. So you have, if I recall correctly, Cowan has, it's like 50 or 60 different mic lines around the building. And each one is probably about 300 feet. Okay? That's a lot of copper. That's a lot of antennas. So all of those cables are acting like antennas, right? And to make things worse, I don't know if you guys know this, do you know what's on the top of Cowan? The transmitter for the radio station is on top of Cowan. So that is the worst place to be, right? From an interference standpoint, because I've got an antenna directly on top of the building. 60 or 70 feet below that antenna, I have 300 foot of mic cable. So how does that mic cable stay quiet? So here's how this works. And this is I find this really interesting that somebody figured out how to do this. So a mic cable is balanced. It has 3 wires in it. You still have the ground. You still have the hot that you had from the unbalanced, but we add another one. Okay? And in a balanced connection, we refer to it as the ground, plus and minus. So what happens is that your microphone sends signal down both the plus and minus cable. And then the ground just, is still there. It's still the reference. But we're traveling for all this space, and why is it not picking up the radio station? Well, in reality, it is picking up the radio station. But what happens is that the microphone sends signal down those two wires, and since they're positive and negative, one of them is in phase and one of them is completely out of phase as it travels down the wire. If you cut the wire open halfway and twisted those two cables together, you'd get nothing. They would cancel out. So what happens is that travels the entire length of that cable, those hundreds of feet of cable, and then when it gets to the mixing console says, oh hey, that third pin is out of phase. So every mixing console on the planet takes the third pin and flips it back in phase as it receives the microphone. Okay? So what does that do? Well, it takes the signals that were out of phase and it puts them in phase, which gives us twice as much signal because we have the audio that we need and we're all happy. But the other thing that it does is that the cable in that wire, the wire in that cable has acted like an antenna for the entire distance. And the radio station has been picked up by those two wires that are in the mic cable. So what happens at the other end is that you invert the phase, you get your signal back, and you cancel out the radio interference that you got on the way there. So we can't stop radio interference from getting into a cable, but a balanced cable by definition cancels out any interference that it picked up on the way. You can literally run mic cable for like a mile and not have a problem. And it's going to act like an antenna. If you just literally cut that cable and connected to it, you could totally pick up a radio station if you wired it. But the way that the cable works, any interference that gets on the way, it cancels out. And it leaves you, it puts your signal back in phase and it cancels out the interference. So that's how you can get those long runs of balanced connections. So whoever came up with that is a genius. So, okay. So, like I said, the XLR is easily the most popular. Whoops. Trapped all my cables with my power cable. There we go. So the XLR is easily the most popular balanced connection, right? I got 3 pins. Oh, where's my camera? I got 3 pins in the male end. I got 3 pins in the female end. Knock yourself out. This has become an industry standard for a couple reasons. Obviously, it's on all microphones, but one of the big reasons is that it locks itself together, right? So it doesn't come disconnected easily. That's one of the big reasons. The letters XLR, the company that first invented the XLR was a company called Canon, not the camera company. And these were called Canon connectors. And XLR, I can't remember, X was the brand, L was locking, and R was rubber, for this rubber gasket that you have right here that just holds it securely. So the L is locking, the R is rubber. The X was the model number. So that's where the term XLR comes from. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. So, yeah. So that's where you get your balanced connection. Now, there's other types of balanced connections, and this is a common one. This is what's referred to as a TRS. See how it's got the two. I'm trying to hold this so you can see it. I'll put it over my mask, you can see it. See how it has the 2 black bands that run around it? It's silver, and then there we go. So those 2 black bands are plastic. In some older ones, they're white and they're ceramic. But basically, plastic is not conductive, right? So I'm separating 3 connections with material that doesn't transmit electricity. So those 2 plastic bands separate this into 3 sections, just like the 3 pins of the XLR. But so why did they bother even coming up with this? Well, the main reason is simple. It's a smaller connector. So I'm not going to switch to the stream just for this. But if you look at the console that I'm sitting next to, every channel has XLR on the back, and it takes up a lot of space to have a bunch of XLR connectors. The middle section of this console, which has my ins and outs for reverbs and things like that, is all TRS. This is all this 1/4-inch TRS cable. By the way, TRS stands for tip, ring, sleeve. So the end is the tip, the smaller part's the ring, and then the bottom part's the sleeve. So that's where the term comes from, TRS. TRS was designed literally as a manufacturing thing to save space. Because this console has so many connections on it that if I were to make every connection on this console XLR, the console would have to be another 6 inches wide with no control. It would just be a bare 6 inches that the backside would have to be longer because it would take up that much more space. In the same space that I can get an XLR, I can get probably 2 or 3 TRS. So I can get a bunch of TRS in the space where I wouldn't have gotten as many XLRs. So it's really a manufacturing thing to save space. Like anything else, it saves money, it's cheaper, it saves space. Since those connections are usually going from my mixer to a reverb unit, it's not like people are going to be tugging on it, so the cable doesn't lock, but who cares? It's not going to be a problem anyway. So that's where TRS comes in to be useful. You can also get cables like this that go from TRS to XLR, still balanced. So, for example, in the studio, I forgot to connect these a while ago, but the little mixer on the desk has inputs from keyboards. The outputs are TRS, but it's going to go into, it might go into an XLR input on the interface. So I might just make one of these cables to go from there to there, and it'll do fine. So the other thing that I realized I just kind of skipped over is a guitar cable looks just like a TRS cable, except for the fact that there is no second band. It's just a guitar cable is called a TS cable, and it's tip sleeve. There's no ring. They remove this second band, and you just have 2 connections in there. Make sense? Okay, so we've talked about balanced, we've talked about unbalanced. So let's talk about some other connections here. I'm going to go through some connections and what they're commonly used for. So let's start with the XLR, the Mighty XLR. This is most obviously microphones use this connection. A lot of professional line levels use this connection. So going from this mixing console to the monitor speakers is an XLR. Okay. Actually, there are some digital connections that use the XLR as well. So it can be balanced. It can also be a digital connection. TRS is most commonly used. TRS is most commonly used with interfacing equipment. Like if I bought a reverb unit and a mixing console or something like that, it would probably be a balanced TRS connection. Okay, those are balanced. Now, you have unbalanced stuff, and you've probably seen this a bunch in like home stuff. You have this little guy. This is what's called an RCA connector, and this is unbalanced because there's only 2 connections on it, right? You got the tip and the sleeve. The tip and the sleeve is a little more obvious on these guys. But this is what you get to break out from your DVD player, your laptop, whatever, to plug into consumer stuff. Your iPod connector, that kind of thing. You also will see, of course, come on, I got a cable, but it's kind of caught. There we go. One of these little guys, these mini 1/8 inch. These are a little bit different. They have 3 conductors in them, but in the way that most people use them, they're not balanced. They're stereo. So you have one ground wire, and then you have left and right being transmitted on the other 2 wires. So they're not balanced, they're unbalanced, but it's carrying a stereo pair. And the ground is shared between the left and the right, which is something that can happen. XLR, TRS, TS. TS is pretty much exclusively used for guitars and instruments. You usually don't see TS anywhere else. I'm trying to think of some other ones. There are some other ones. Let me do a quick Google search and then a screen share here. Okay, we got that going. Let's go to internet's being slow today. Okay, so sometimes you'll see something like this, and I'm going to go over and I'm going to present a window. There we go. That's the one I want to share. Okay, so this is the thing I'm showing you here. This connection on the left is what's called a D sub or a DB25 connection. And basically, if you look in that connection, you can see that there are a bunch of different pins in there. Basically, if you want to think about that, it's a bunch of miniature XLRs. Every set of 3 pins is one. Every set of 3 pins breaks out to one of these TRS that are on the other end of the snake. And as a matter of fact, if you want to see that specifically, we have... No, we don't. I'm sorry. I lied. I was going to say there's one in the studio, but there's not anymore. I take that back. But you can get XLR on the other end of these snakes too. DB25 is really useful because it takes up very little space. A DB25 takes up about the amount of space of 2 TRS and roughly a little bit more than an XLR. So it saves a crap ton of space, but it's 8 channels in that little connector right there. But as you can imagine, it's not a super popular connection, so you can't buy a bunch of those and just move on because most equipment doesn't have a DB25. So so that's one way that you can do your that's one way that you can do that is the DB25. Now there's another connector, and I'm just going to find it online because I'm not sure exactly where it is not exactly sure where I put mine in the building here. Okay, so I'm going to screen share this puppy again. Okay, this is what's called a speak-on connector. Let me specifically go there. Speak-on connectors are, to continue the conversation, they're basically unbalanced because a speaker cable is unbalanced. It just has a ground and a signal strength. Now, there's a little note here that speaker cables only have 2 wires in them, but they can go super long distances. Why is that? Because there is so much energy, there's so much electricity and signal going through a speaker wire that any interference from the radio station is insignificant. So it doesn't have to be a balanced cable. So, like I said, mic instrument and line level are not really anything. You could put your finger on the cable and you wouldn't even feel it. Speaker cable power is literally thousands of times a higher magnitude than what you're dealing with at line level. So that's the knock you on your butt, send you to the hospital stuff. It's so much, it's like thousands of times more powerful than your mic level. So any interference that's like coming out in like a milliwatt has no chance of fighting a 10,000 watt power amplifier. So we don't even bother making that a balanced cable. It's just 2 wires. But anyway, the whole point of this is that speakers used to use TS cables, and they would go in the connector, and that'd be fine, except when you pulled the cable out. Because when a TS connector, whoops, I need to go back to my screen so you can see my fingers here. When a TS connector goes in a connector, there's 2 pieces. Pretend my knuckle is one of those black plastic bands separating my fingertip and whatever you call this part of your finger. So when you put a TS cable into a speaker, it connects like that. Like there's 2 prongs that come up inside and connect that way, which is fine, except for the fact that when I plugged it in, the tip touched the wrong one to start with, and then it went and switched over to the other one. Right? This is why if you plug or unplug a speaker while it's on, it pops. Because as the connector goes through all those connections, you basically tell the speaker to instantly be out and not at rest, so it instantly just shoves itself out, and that's why a speaker pops. It's not good for the speaker. It's not good for the speaker at all. So you don't want to do that. So what a Neutrik does, and this is really a cool design, is that it goes in and the pins are side by side. And the way to explain it is, say that this is the ground, okay? This should be wider than this one. So what happens with a speak-on is when you plug it in, it makes connection with the ground first because it's a wider plate of metal, and then you rotate the connector. And as you rotate the connector, the signal cable makes contact second. And then when you disconnect it, the signal cable disconnects first, and then the ground disconnects when you pull it out. So since the ground is always connected first and they never switch, you never get a pop. So speak-ons are great because you cannot pop a speaker. You literally can plug and unplug speakers while the amp is on, and it doesn't hurt the amplifier or the speaker because it always connects the ground first and then it connects the signal. The other thing about speak-on that people really like is that it locks like an XLR. It snaps in place and it locks in place. So in the past, when your clumsy singer tripped over a cable, they would pull the cable out of the speaker and it would make a popping sound and it would damage the speaker and the sound guy would be mad. Now if the clumsy singer trips over the cable, they face plant and your gear is fine. So it's good for us, it's bad for the clumsy singer. So, yeah, speak-ons are really useful for that. Now, there is another part of this that can be a little bit of a warning. And what that is that the connector doesn't care what you put through it. I actually used to have, and I haven't seen another one since, I used to own a bass amplifier, and my speakers that I owned were speak-on connections. But the outputs, I promise this is true, the outputs of my speaker outputs from my bass amplifier were XLR. So it was speaker level coming out of an XLR connector. Now it was speaker wire, because you have to use speaker wire for speakers, but it came out of an XLR. Why? Because the amp was small enough that they didn't have room for speak-on, and also the amp came out a couple years before speak-on was a thing. So the only way for them to have a locking connection was to use an XLR connector. So I had to make custom speaker cables that went from XLR to speak-on. So it was great. I knew that they wouldn't ever wiggle loose, right? Because they were locked in on both sides. The speak-ons locked into my speaker cabinets, and the XLRs locked into my amps, so it wasn't a problem. But I had to build custom cables for that. Because the cable is what cares about what's going through it, not the connector. So another case in point is that you can send digital, I can send a stereo digital signal down a balanced cable as well. A stereo digital signal. It's just data. It's not sound, it's just data. But if I take this mic cable and I try to transmit digital, it won't work because this is mic cable. If I get what's called an AES-EBU cable, it looks just like a mic cable, except the cable itself says digital on it. Because the cable it's a higher quality copper, the resistance, the electrical resistance is lower, it's just a little bit of a nicer mic cable, basically. And that can transmit digital, and the interesting thing is it also still works for mic, but the cheap mic cable doesn't work for digital. The cable cares what you send down it. The connector doesn't. There's one other thing that I hope you never have to deal with. When we moved in, and this was we used to have a mixing console in the studio there that had unbalanced outputs on in the early 80s when I had to make specific cables for that went from XLR unbalanced to a TS cable on the other end. So if you ever get an older cheap mixer from the early 80s and it for some reason won't work, it may be because your XLR outs are unbalanced. It was a rare thing. It never happens anymore. Things have been standardized. Nobody does that, but it happens. And again, it's not that you'll ever see it. It's just to press the point home. Cables don't care. I'm sorry, connectors don't care what goes through them. Cables do. If you really wanted to, so an NL2, that speak-on I just showed you, that was what's called an NL2. They also have an NL4 that's able to hold 4 wires inside of it. And normally what that's used for is in live sound, you'll use one cable and you plug it in, and then you run another cable to another speaker and you can power the 2 speakers separately. It's just 2 sets of speaker cables in one cable is all that really is. But again, the connector doesn't care. If I wanted to, I could send line level signal through a speak-on connector with normal mic wire in a speak-on connector, and it would totally work because the connector doesn't care. The cable cares. So what this comes down to is that if you're not sure, look on the cable. And you probably can't read this, but this actually says GLS Audio Professional Series Noise Free. You probably can't read that, but the cable will actually have something printed on it. So you can totally look at that to make sure that you've got the right kind of cable. Okay? The great thing is that nowadays, pretty much everything is XLR anymore. Very little is, well, TRS is still pretty popular, but nowadays, yeah, TRS is actually very popular. Pretty much everything is TRS and XLR anymore, for the most part. I'm not going to go grab it just because there's nothing to see, but we do have an XLR. We have a couple XLR cables in here they're very skinny black cables, and if you read the cable, it says AES-EBU digital cable. All digital cable is really nice mic cable. It has to be at a higher standard to transmit digital. So if you ever come across a cable that says digital on it, but it has XLRs on it, you can totally use it as a mic cable. This studio has digital cable run throughout the place because of the way that the original owner had. But there's a lot of it we didn't need. So I literally cut it off the wall, put a connector on it, and we use them as mic cables. We use them on a daily basis. They're actually just really nice mic cables. They're overkill for mic cables, but it'll work the other way. So mic cables are dumb. They can use a high quality mic cable. Digital is picky. Digital can't use a cheaper mic cable. It has to use the really nice stuff. So for the most part, that's what you're dealing with whenever you have these kind of connections. Let me put this back real quick. You know what? There's one more cable I want to point out to you, and it's this guy. This is what's called a TT. TT stands for tiny telephone. It's just a smaller version of a TRS, basically. The only time you see these is in professional studios for patch bays. Because the size of this connection here, in one rack space, which is about 1.5 inches high and 19 inches wide, I can get 96 connections using this in that space. If I use this, I can get 48 connections in that space. So again, it's just a matter of saving space and cost and that kind of thing. Okay, so have we talked about? Is everybody good? That's pretty basics. Most of that shouldn't be too super confusing. Okay, so I do want to talk. Well, we got enough time here to start the conversation about how digital audio works, because this is something else that's going to be important when we start recording here. Oh, before I forget, because I do keep forgetting. You guys may have used this before. There's a program called Doodle, and it's basically an online calendar. So what I'm going to do is on Doodle, I'm going to post a bunch of potential times, and each one of you is going to be listed in this Doodle thing. And what you do is you go through it and you check the boxes when you are available. Right? So let's say I put Friday and I put noon, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and I'm on the Doodle list. And I'm booked from 6 p.m. on, and I have a meeting at 2 p.m. So I will check noon and 1 o'clock, and then I will check 3 and 4 and 5 o'clock, and then I won't check anything else because I'm not available. So what this is going to do is it's going to show us who's available for what, so that when those musical theater students come in to do their recording in 241, that we know which one of you is going to do that recording for them. Okay? So I always send you all a link to that Doodle thing. So please respond and show me that, and then I'm going to show that to the musical theater people, and we'll figure that out there. So ideally, and I'll put this out now. Ideally, I would love for everybody to record at least one person, but because of the world we're living in and the situation we're living in, if you cannot get in to do it, or you're not comfortable coming in with somebody else you don't know or whatever, I'm not going to grade this one. Okay? I really want you to get to the experience, but I'm not going to make it a requirement just because of the nature of what's going on. That also reminds me, so make sure that you've all sent me your PTX files, which is the little purple icon in your folder for Pro Tools. Don't send me audio files. Send me your PTX files for all the mixes we've done. That will be in your grade book. I'm sorry, I haven't caught up. I've got them all saved. I've been keeping track of them. I've been taking a peek at them. But because of our time, I just haven't really addressed it. But that's where your grade's going to come from, is whether or not you've turned in your PTX files. So, so that's the for me, that's the most important thing, is whether or not you've done that stuff. So that's the grade is, I have to grade something. So that's the grade. If you turn that in, that's the grade. So that's basically where we're at. Cool. Okay. So, great. We have a little bit of time. I'm going to switch over to the stream because I need to use the board for this. We're going to talk about how digital audio works. Okay. I'm going to turn up the mic so that when I walk over there, you still hear me. Okay, so if any of you guys have ever messed with digital video, you're probably aware of something called the frame rate, and that is how often we capture a picture so that it looks smooth. So the thing for the industry standard for video, for film rather, for movies, is 24 frames per second. And that just means that the camera takes a picture every hour, set up so that we can see 24 frames per second go by, and it will look like smooth video to us. We don't see individual pictures. We see a smooth change, right? As a matter of fact, the live stream that I'm streaming right now is streaming at 24 frames per second. So, although the camera I'm actually on right now is kind of a cheap camera, and it's doing something weird, I'm noticing. But for the most part, I should look natural, because basically we are streaming at 24 frames per second. So we're getting chunks of information, right? Video is not a continuous stream. It's a continuous stream. Oops, I just realized I'm not showing you the right picture. That's me. There we go. There we go. Now you can see me. So, video is not one thing as it goes through and captures each one. So, and I'm actually going to write this down because this actually is important. So, is 24 frames per second, FPS, if you ever see FPS. You'll notice in Pro Tools that Pro Tools, if you look at your options for the counter at the top, one of your option is foot and frames, because you measure film by how many feet it is, because obviously it's a long roll of film. So they go by foot and frames. So 24 frames per second is that. So instead are going to capture audio much faster, and this what used to be, well, what's referred to as CD standard, even 44.1 kilohertz. Okay, that means that we are sampling 44,100 times per second. Oop. Hold on a second. Stream okay for you guys? Because I'm getting a weird pop-up message here.
Yeah, it's not okay.
It's buffering, and it's just to the point where you're talking center frame rate.
Yeah.
Oh Jesus. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm switching back to this then. Forget that.
Yeah, you switch.